Our relationships change the course of our lives, but can they change history? I'm the Affair Archivist, and this month we'll be exploring a long-forgotten sex scandal of the Gilded Age, the Beecher-Tilton affair. In the summer of 1874, a journalist appeared on the doorstep of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home in Tenafly, New Jersey. He wasn't there to interview her about her efforts to get women the right to vote, however. He was looking for some juicy gossip, and she delivered. Stanton relayed a tale told to her by Susan B. Anthony, who, 4 years earlier, found herself in the middle of a domestic dispute that would later become a national news sensation. Anthony was at the home of Theodore Tilton, a prominent writer and lecturer, and his wife, Elizabeth, during an intense row. Anthony protected Mrs. Tilton from her husband's ire. As the two women remained locked behind a bedroom door, Tilton pounded upon it with great force, threatening to kill his wife. Anthony refused to open the door for long enough that Tilton eventually gave up. She spent the night with the distraught Elizabeth, who confided in the women's suffrage leader that she was unfaithful to her husband. By the time the story hit the newsstands, the private business of the Tilton family, along with the famous Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, Elizabeth's alleged lover, was making headlines across the country. Though the Beecher-Tilton affair is not a scandal that rings many bells today, in the 1870s, Americans were glued to newspaper reports with tidbits on the affair and the ensuing trial. Going beyond juicy gossip, the Beecher-Tilton affair was a symbol of changing tides in gender roles, religion, and the institution of marriage in post-Civil War America. To this day, it is still unclear if the affair between Elizabeth Tilton and Henry Ward Beecher happened at all. Nonetheless, this case of criminal intimacy would forever change the lives of all involved. Theodore Tilton forged a close bond with Henry Ward Beecher when he joined the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights at the age of 16 in 1851. In the mid-1800s, Brooklyn was not yet a part of New York City and was called the City of Churches, a hub of religious activity, as well as the home of many prominent writers, activists, and intellectuals. Tilton transcribed Beecher's sermons and soon became an admirer of the Protestant preacher. Beecher was born in June of 1813 and was making a name for himself for his passionate speaking skills and liberal approach to religion. His father, Lyman Beecher, was also a preacher, but more of the fire and brimstone variety than his son. Beecher believed that one should pursue spirituality to achieve personal fulfillment, as opposed to a means of maintaining social order. Beecher came from a prominent and influential family. His sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. He began preaching at Plymouth Church in 1847. He was an advocate for the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage. Manhattanites would take the ferry to Brooklyn to worship with him each Sunday. Many considered him more of a showman than a man of God. His light-hearted sermons, which often incorporated humor, were unorthodox for the time period and attracted some criticism. However, it is undeniable that Beecher was America's foremost preacher. Beecher married Tilton and Elizabeth in 1855, referring to them as one of the fairest couples I've ever married. The pair met as children and later fell in love. Elizabeth was a year older than her husband. She was involved in the women's rights movement. She established and taught at a school for married working-class women at Plymouth Church. She and Tilton had 6 children, 2 of which died in childhood. A friend described Elizabeth in a rather unflattering way. She was not charming or graceful or pretty, as either men or women count prettiness, but her eyes were pleasant, her teeth white, and her manner caressing. She was incredibly devoted to her faith and, as we will learn, her pastor. Henry Bowen, owner and publisher of The Independent, hired Beecher as an editor and Tilton as an assistant editor in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was a subscriber to the newspaper. A biographer wrote, Beecher first knew Theodore Tilton as a clever and attractive young man who reported his sermons. Even before the latter became his editorial assistant, Beecher had become fond of him and interested in his future. Bowen, Beecher, and Tilton were known as the Trinity of Plymouth Church. Beecher and Tilton were so close that the preacher once tried to kiss his apprentice on the forehead, but accidentally kissed him on the mouth. Everyone laughed at this and did not believe it was out of the ordinary. Rumors of infidelity with his parishioners were sometimes whispered about Beecher. In the mid-1860s, Bowen claimed that his wife confessed to having an affair with Beecher on her deathbed. Stewing with rage and resentment, Bowen went around town with this tale, relaying it to Tilton. For the time being, however, it did not seem to have a negative impact on Tilton and Beecher's friendship. Tilton went out of his way to show Beecher the extent of his devotion to him. During the Civil War, when Beecher's son was discharged from the army under mysterious and dishonorable circumstances, Tilton traveled to Washington, D.C., and met with the Secretary of War, convincing him to give Beecher's son a new commission, which he did. Though he was an outspoken abolitionist, Tilton paid for a replacement to fight in the Union Army for him. Yet it was the war that would drive a wedge between the two friends, as Tilton learned of the limitations of Beecher's beliefs about abolition and Reconstruction. Tilton was so devoted to the cause he believed Abe Lincoln was not doing enough and advocated for another candidate to run for the Republican Party in 1864. He felt that the South would need to agree to conditions to be admitted back into the Union, many of which centered around the rights of African Americans. Beecher, however, believed that the North should go easy on the South after victory. He also held the view that African Americans were inferior to whites, a belief that was common even amongst supposedly progressive people of the time. He argued that black people would need to work with whites to become civilized. Tilton disagreed with this stance. By 1866, Tilton became disillusioned with his former mentor, Plymouth Church, and religion as a whole. He said, "I ceased, as I grew older, to look upon Mr. Beecher as a leader, either in politics or art or religion. Not that I dethroned him in my respect, but that he was less to me, as I grew older, a leader than he had been originally." This move away from Beecher and religion was also brought about by a few other factors: the death of his and Elizabeth's young son, Paul, and the end of the Civil War. After the war, Tilton felt that he had more time to reflect and contemplate the true meaning of life, since he was no longer focused on advocating for abolition. It was then that religion fell down the list of his priorities. This was incredibly distressing to Elizabeth. Tilton left Plymouth Church around 1866, and she begged him for years to return. In 1869, she wrote to him, "Do not let this entreaty estrange us more, for my pillow oft is wet with tears and prayers that we may come into sympathy in our religious natures. It is impossible for me to be indifferent, especially when God blesses us with our dear children. I once again ask forgiveness if I have offended you by showing my heart." Tilton assured his wife that he loved her more than God. "I am filled with distress to think that I must keep you uninformed, for the sake of your own tranquility, of many of my thoughts, and some of my conduct." Some have interpreted this line to be an admission of Tilton's own affairs, though this has never been proven. The split between Tilton and his wife, as well as Beecher, would set the stage for the outbreak of a major scandal. To grapple with her husband's sudden loss of faith, Elizabeth found comfort and solace in the words, and perhaps the actions, of Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher would often come over to the Tiltons' home on Livingston Street in Brooklyn to bring her flowers and provide counsel while her husband was away on speaking engagements. In the future adultery trial, two of the Tiltons' employees claimed to see Beecher and Elizabeth in the drawing room in a compromising position. Beecher drew Mrs. Tilton close to him, lifted her, and kissed her on the cheek while she kissed him back. Mrs. Tilton was reclining on a lounge, her clothes up above her knees. Beecher was in the act of rising from the said lounge. During the infamous trial in 1875, Tilton's lawyers claimed that Elizabeth and Beecher once sat on the floor looking at a photo album. Beecher reached inside of Elizabeth's long skirt to touch her ankle. Tilton came home one day and found them locked behind a bedroom door with Beecher sitting in a chair with his vest off. Elizabeth claimed the children were being too loud and rowdy and that they just wanted to talk. On Christmas Eve of 1870, Elizabeth may have had a miscarriage in the 3rd month of pregnancy, though whether this is true or not is unclear. What has been even more contested throughout the decades is the paternity of the lost child. Tilton believed that it was Beecher's, not his own baby. He made his wife, still recovering, sign a letter in which she confessed to an affair with Beecher. Elizabeth only agreed to sign after her husband promised her it would not be used against Beecher. Immediately breaking that promise, Tilton stormed to a mutual friend's house to show Beecher the document and accused him of criminal intimacy. Tilton later said, "He received my accusation without denial and confessed it by his assenting manner and grief." In a dramatic display, Tilton tore up the letter and told Beecher to go to his wife for a verbal confession. He trudged over to the Tiltons' home in a snowstorm, came to Elizabeth's sickbed, and asked her what had happened. According to Beecher, she opened her eyes and said, "My friend, I could not help it. Oh, Mr. Beecher, I was wearied out. I have been. I have been weary with his importunities. He'd made me think that if I would confess love to you, it would help him confess to me his alien affections," meaning his own affairs. Beecher asked Elizabeth to put this version of events recanting her husband's torn-up letter into writing, which she did. In this statement she wrote, "Mr. Beecher has never offered any improper solicitation, but has always treated me in a manner becoming of a Christian and a gentleman." When they finished this letter around midnight, Beecher left. When Tilton returned home, he was furious that Elizabeth recanted her confession. He made her write yet another letter to support his version of events. Despite all of the drama and letter writing, over the next few years the Tiltons would try to forget the affair and move on with their lives. However, rumors and Victoria Woodhull would prevent that from happening. The affair was kept mostly quiet and was only known in the circle of the Plymouth Church members of Brooklyn. Tilton, a man scorned, did have a hard time shutting up about it. As the years went by, the rumors spread, eventually leading to the exposure of the affair. Victoria Woodhull was a trailblazing woman with an interesting legacy. She was the first woman to run for president, opened a finance firm on Wall Street, was a spiritualist healer, and started a newspaper with her sister, Tennessee Claflin. She was an advocate of women's rights, but was especially passionate about the concept of free love, which was the belief that people should be allowed to love who they want when they want. She revolted against the idea of marriage being a lifelong contract and advocated for a woman's right to leave her husband if she no longer loved him, which was radical stuff for the time period. Her ideas were controversial and caused her to be shunned from the community. Victoria was outraged by the hypocrisy she witnessed from prominent New Yorkers, one of which included Henry Ward Beecher. Woodhull knew that Beecher had been intimate with several of his parishioners, stating, "I am reliably assured that Henry Ward Beecher preaches to at least 20 of his mistresses every Sunday." In May of 1871, after learning of the affair between Elizabeth Tilton and Beecher from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Victoria wrote a letter to the editor of both the New York World and the Times. "I know of one man, a public teacher of eminence who lives in concubinage with the wife of another public teacher of almost equal eminence. All three concur in denouncing offenses against morality. I shall make it my business to analyze some of these lives, and will take my chances in the matter of libel suits." It was a bold-faced threat, especially to Beecher. If he didn't start preaching what he practiced, she was going to air his dirty laundry out in front of everybody. Tilton immediately went into damage control, visiting Victoria, asking her who she was referring to in her letter to the editor. "I mean you and Mr. Beecher," she replied, telling him it was her mission to bring it to the knowledge of the world. He begged her not to say anything, and she agreed, for the time being. Tilton did whatever he could to shut her up, which turned out to be writing an overly complimentary biography of her life that sugar-coated her impoverished background and further touted the benefits of her ideology and causes. The intent of the biography was to rehabilitate Victoria's image. However, it only destroyed Tilton's credibility as a journalist and writer. They spent the summer together, boating on the Hudson and visiting Coney Island. He spent one night in her mansion. This would later become a huge sticking point in the adultery trial. Tilton was accused of having an affair with Woodhull to keep her quiet, but he claimed that they stayed in separate rooms. Victoria also browbeat Tilton into arranging a meeting between herself and Beecher. She confronted him about his anti-free love stance. Beecher replied, "I should preach to empty seats. It would be the ruin of my church." She wrote to him, "You doubtless know that it is in my power to strike back in ways more disastrous than anything that can come to me. I do not desire to do this. I simply desire justice, and a reasonable course on your part will assist me to it. I must have an interview tomorrow. What I say or shall not say will depend largely on the result of the interview." Beecher would not budge in the face of Woodhull's demands and blackmail. During another meeting in which she pressured him to advocate for free love, she claims Beecher said, "I should sink through the floor. I am a moral coward on this subject, and you know it. After saying this, he cried. Beecher asked her to give him a 24-hour warning if she decided to make his shame public, so that he could take his own life before he was exposed. Keep in mind this was all according to Victoria. When Beecher half-heartedly agreed to introduce Victoria at one of her lectures in November of 1871, but did not show up, Victoria was ready to make good on her promise to destroy him. Though she did not expose him in this particular speech, which was delivered to a packed room of approximately 3,000 people, her actual plan would be even more destructive, especially to her and her sister. Victoria, on the brink of destitution, asked Beecher for money. By the early 1870s, Woodhull's bid for the presidency was the subject of intense ridicule. She was ostracized from the women's suffrage movement. Her Wall Street firm was derelict. She lost her mansion and was evicted from the apartment she was staying in. Due to her scandalous views, she was refused from hotels across New York City. Beecher, unconcerned with the information she held over his head, did nothing. Finally, her resentment reached a fever pitch, and she took to her paper, the Woodhull and Claflin Weekly, to blow the whole thing open. On November 2nd, 1872, the Weekly published a headline that read, "The Beecher-Tilton Case, the detailed statement on the whole matter by Mrs. Woodhull." She called it one of the most stupendous scandals which has ever occurred in any community. Victoria spelled out her agenda. "I intend that this article shall burst like a bombshell into the ranks of the moralistic social camp." She was exposing the affair to show that those who criticized her beliefs and way of life were really no better than her in their actions outside of the public arena. Victoria included several other sordid details, writing about Elizabeth's pregnancy by Beecher and her miscarriage. She also claimed that Tilton had torn off his wife's wedding ring in a rage and tore the picture of Mr. Beecher from Elizabeth's wall and stamped it to pieces. She said Beecher helped to maintain for these many years that very social slavery under which he was chafing and against which he was secretly revolting, both in thought and practice. He has, in a word, consented and still consents to being a hypocrite, failing, in a word, to stand shoulder to shoulder with me and others who are endeavoring to hasten a social regeneration which he believes in. While Victoria believed that the main sin committed by those involved was hypocrisy, everyone else believed it to be adultery, and this would be the focus of the trial and media sensation, not Woodhull's beliefs. The issue exposing the Beecher-Tilton affair sold like buttered hotcakes. The first run of 100,000 copies completely sold out. Though this had the potential to reverse Victoria and her sister's financial woes, it quickly backfired, as they were arrested for libel and obscenity. They were set up by the Plymouth Church when they sold some copies of the weekly through mail. At the time, selling offensive material through mail was a crime. Authorities destroyed the offices of the weekly and their printing equipment so they could no longer run the newspaper. Though the charges against them were eventually dropped, the fallout from the revelation would seriously damage Victoria's health. The sisters ended up moving to England. Woodhull later admitted that it was not just her anger at Beecher's hypocrisy, but his failure to support her career or help her when she lost all of her opportunities and money that influenced her to expose him. For Beecher and the Tiltons, however, Woodhull's expose was just the beginning of the debacle. After Woodhull's revelation, all involved, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, denied knowing of, being involved with, or participating in an affair. The media had a field day with the whole story. Though the church tried to cover up the scandal, it was too late. Beecher's fame around the country made the accusations impossible to keep quiet. He may not have accused Beecher of anything publicly yet, but Tilton was criticized for making no effort to defend his wife's honor. In 1872, a letter he wrote was published in the Brooklyn Eagle. "If you think I do not burn to defend my wife and little ones, you know not the fiery spirit within me. But my wife's heart is more a fountain of charity and quenches all resentments. I shall try with patience to keep my answer within my own breast, lest it shoot forth like a thunderbolt through other hearts." These statements caused significant tension between husband and wife, since he titillated the press by suggesting there was more to the story, rather than providing an outright denial of his wife's wrongdoing. "Your note in the Eagle of last night was so heartless," Elizabeth wrote to him the next day. You should have sheltered me. A noble man would. All the more because the truth, innocence demanded nothing from you. To you I owe this great injustice of exposure, such as has never before befallen a woman. Blow after blow, ceaseless and unrelenting these 3 years. O cruel spirit born of the devil in anger and revenge, you know what I am. Yet now that exposure has come, my whole nature revolts to join with you or standing with you. Elizabeth still believed, despite all the betrayal, that they would eventually reconcile. In 1873, Tilton was excommunicated from Plymouth Church. This was a result of the publicity the scandal had attracted. Tilton could not keep his mouth shut, sending rebuttals to newspapers that published articles about the affair. Often these explanations disparaged Beecher, leading to his removal from the church that he had already left in his heart and mind years prior. He also lost his job at the Independent in 1870, after Bowen accused him of being an adulterer, a decision Beecher supported. By 1874, Tilton decided he had had enough. He wrote, "There is one thing I was born for, and that is war," which is ironic since he paid a substitute during the Civil War, but I digress. Tilton was going to fight back, even if it meant the ruin of he and his wife's reputations. He believed that Beecher ought to spend the rest of his life in penitence and anguish, and intended to dole it out to him. Tilton lost his job, was blacklisted from his community because of Beecher's influence and power, and lost his wife's respect and love. Perhaps believing he had nothing else to lose, Tilton decided to come out against Beecher publicly in April of 1874. He sued him for adultery, accusing Beecher of not only being physically intimate with his wife, but also swaying her affections away from her husband. Before the case went to court, the Plymouth Church congregation was determined to get to the bottom of what happened. They formed a committee, or perhaps more accurately, a kangaroo court, to investigate any potential wrongdoing on Beecher's part. Given that Beecher was the face of the church, it is no surprise that the committee was incredibly biased in his favor. In the end, of course, they cleared him of any indiscretion in August of 1874, stating that Beecher had borne the brunt of vicious and vengeful actions committed by the Tiltons. That same summer, Tilton published one of his wife's letters from 1870, in which he claimed she confessed to her mother about the affair. "Why, what have you done, Elizabeth, my child?" Her worst suspicions were aroused, and I laid bare my heart then, that from my lip, and not yours, she might receive the dagger into her heart. It hath been her death blow. It remained unclear what bombshell news Elizabeth was referring to in the letter, but it didn't exactly help her case. Another letter, written by Elizabeth to Beecher in the spring of 1871, proved controversial. "Mr. Beecher, my future either for life or death would be happier, could I but feel you forgave me while you forget me. In all the sad complications of the past year, my endeavor was to entirely keep you from all suffering, to bear myself alone, leaving you forever ignorant of it. My weapons were love, a larger, untiring generosity, and nest-hiding. That I failed utterly, we both know, but now I ask forgiveness." The term nest-hiding was interpreted as a declaration of love by Tilton's lawyers. However, like most of the letters in this whole situation, the meaning is very vague and can be interpreted in several ways. The trial began in January of 1875 and was immediately a circus, with hordes of people trying to gain entry to the courtroom. While the crowds used to take ferries into Brooklyn to see Beecher's sermons, now they were traveling to witness his potential disgrace. Tickets to the courtroom were scalped $5 apiece, worth almost $150 today. Mark Twain attended the proceedings at one point. Beecher's side of the courtroom was decorated with flowers every day, signifying that most of the public was on his side. The flowers helped to counteract the smell of garbage that the crowds left behind each day after the proceedings. During the trial, Beecher was steadfast that he loved Elizabeth like a daughter. "I kissed her as I would any of my own family." Elizabeth claimed her husband had been cruel and abusive towards her, accusing him of locking her in a room and interrogating her about the paternity of their children. She also accused him of being an advocate and practitioner of free love since 1870, and of having an affair with Victoria Woodhull. Elizabeth even went as far as to claim that it was her husband that had penned the infamous letter published in Woodhull and Coughlin's Weekly. In response, Tilton published 200 love letters between him and his wife. a few of which had been written only a few months before the loss of her honor in 1868, according to Tilton. This contradicted Elizabeth's statements. He also admitted he had only gotten friendly with Woodhull to prevent her from going public with what she knew. Elizabeth did admit to wrongdoing in that she and Beecher's close friendship hurt her husband's pride. I do not think, if I had known as much as I do now of Tilton, that I should ever have encouraged Mr. Beecher's acquaintance. I think I did wrong in doing it, inasmuch as it had hurt Theodore. When Beecher testified, he claimed he was only trying to provide counsel to Elizabeth during a time in which she was falling in with the wrong crowd, according to him. He claimed that Elizabeth thrust her affections upon me unsought. He defended himself in the cover-up, stating that it seemed to be that my life work was to end abruptly in disaster. He believed he was a victim of a monstrous conspiracy. Beecher's legal team ensured that Victoria Woodhull did not testify. He also sent the Tiltons' housekeeper and ward, Bessie, to a school on the West Coast to prevent her from being summoned to give a statement. Bessie would have been a witness to many of Elizabeth and Beecher's meetings. Elizabeth also did not testify, but she was present each day and frequently sobbing in court. Beecher was glad that Elizabeth did not take the stand, as he did not believe she would be able to handle the cross-examination. Beecher himself came under heavy scrutiny during the trial, which made many of his previous supporters question his innocence. On New Year's Day, 1871, Beecher sent a letter of contrition to Tilton through their mutual friend, Frank Moulton. He wrote, "I ask through you Theodore Tilton's forgiveness, and I humble myself before Theodore Tilton as before my God." When this damning letter came up during the trial, Beecher claimed that he had dictated the letter to Moulton, who misrepresented his actual meaning. What he really meant to communicate is unclear. The pastor's credibility took another hit when his emotional outbursts and desire to take his own life were brought up during the trial. When Victoria Woodhull made the claim that Beecher threatened to take his own life if his transgressions were revealed, no one believed her. However, when Frank Moulton's wife, Emma, took the stand and told a similar story, it proved to be a compelling bit of evidence against him. Beecher claimed he had apoplexy and was living with chronic pain, which caused the emotional outbursts. Tilton's legal team presented Beecher's life insurance policy, which made no mention of any health conditions, to debunk this explanation. The Times wrote, "Every theory advanced by Mr. Beecher during the trial is expressly contradicted by his own former admissions and letters." Tilton was also heavily criticized for allowing Elizabeth to leave him and side against him in the trial. Since he did not protest or try to keep her, he must have been a supporter of free love, people theorized. However, Tilton blamed Beecher, not his wife, claiming she was under Beecher's spell. "I must find some excuse for her. Other people might blame, but I must pardon her. I found that excuse in the fact that she had been wrapped up in her religious teacher and guide. She had surrendered her convictions to him. She followed his beck and lead trustingly. She would go after him like one blinded. I think she sinned her sin as one in a trance. I don't think she was a free agent. I think she would have done his bidding." Men lost respect for Tilton because he placed the blame on Beecher as opposed to his wife, seeing him as weak. In July of 1875, the trial concluded, but a verdict was not reached. All of the rumors, accusations, exposures, and scandal resulted in an anticlimactic hung jury. The trial was over, and the scandal would eventually fade from the headlines. Henry Ward Beecher maintained his job and social status, but still saw himself as the victim of the whole debacle. In February of 1876, he stated, "I have not been hunted as an eagle is hunted. I have not been pursued as a lion is pursued. I have not been pursued as even wolves and foxes. I have been pursued as if I were a maggot in a rotten corpse." In April of 1878, a letter from Elizabeth Tilton was published in newspapers across America. Though it had been nearly 3 years since the intimate details of her marriage and alleged affair had transfixed a nation, Elizabeth still felt the need to set the record straight. In her letter, she wrote, "The charge brought by my husband of adultery between myself and the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was true, and that the lie I had lived so well the last 4 years had become an intolerable one. That statement I now solemnly reaffirm and leave the truth with God, to whom I also commit myself, my children, and all who suffer. I know full well the explanations that will be sought by many for this acknowledgment. Desire to return to my husband, insanity, malice, everything save the true and only one, my quickened conscience, and the sense of what is due to the cause of truth and justice. Beecher and his attorney claimed that Elizabeth was insane. I think there is something radically wrong in her mental operations. The press believed that Elizabeth only published her confession to reconcile with her husband. The newspapers tore Elizabeth apart, claiming she was not to be trusted. This weak and erring woman has so hopelessly forsworn herself as to forfeit all claim to attention or credence, the Times wrote. She was excommunicated from Plymouth Church. Whether Elizabeth was motivated to confess by her faith, her conscience, her marriage, or her children is unclear. She may have wanted to finally end the speculation that hung over her head and the heads of her children for several years. It was likely that she confessed so that her children would not have to live with her mistakes. Because Elizabeth changed her story so many times, it is difficult to know if an affair actually took place or not. However, she and Tilton never reconciled. She lived with friends and ran her mother's boarding house for the remainder of her life. She tried to write a semi-autobiographical novel about the affair, but it was never published. She died in 1897. Theodore Tilton stayed in America for 8 years after the end of the trial, but moved to France in 1883, likely to escape the pall the scandal had cast over his entire life and career. He continued writing in Paris and hosted many famous people, including Frederick Douglass, at his apartment. He ended up being the longest living of the three, dying in 1907. Though the Tiltons' lives were undone by the scandal, Beecher remained relatively unscathed, though he did lose some of the national prominence and fame he enjoyed beforehand. He continued preaching at Plymouth Church up until his death in 1887. A statue of him was erected outside of Brooklyn's Borough Hall in 1891. Elizabeth and Beecher were both buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Tilton is interred far away in France. The adultery trial ended up being about much more than just a love triangle between a pastor and members of his congregation. It brought up issues of religion, marriage, sex, and politics during a time of post-war uncertainty. Some saw it as an erosion of the institution of marriage and the family, which was under threat due to the shift from an agrarian-based economy to an industrial one. Beecher's more liberal approach to God also came under fire, with his more conservative critics claiming that Beecher's liberal approach to religion would destroy the social order and culture of America. Beecher's eagerness to forget and move on from the scandal was evidenced in a sermon from 1874, providing a good bookend for the entire tale. May whatever is good in us ripen. May whatever is evil in us be more and more overruled. May we not refuse to go forward by sitting down in sinfulness and remorse, and forever looking back and bemoaning our mistakes, or our want of improvement and privileges, or our sorrows and bereavement. May we forget what is behind. We are children not of the past, but of the future. We live by faith and are filled with hope. Thank you very much for watching. I'm the Affair Archivist. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and join me next time as we explore another affair from history.